All right, let's just dive right in. Today we're looking at what is probably the absolute most foundational concept in modern Christian theology, and it all revolves around how we understand just 6 English words found in 2 Timothy 3:16, and those words are, all scripture is inspired by God. Now, for centuries, those 6 words have carried massive, and I mean massive, theological stakes. They're routinely pointed to as the absolute clearest self-testimony of the Bible's inspiration. And for a lot of people, they serve as the ultimate proof text for the doctrine of biblical infallibility or inerrancy. But what if the way we read those words today is completely, entirely disconnected from what they originally meant? And that brings us to the central mystery of our explainer today. It's kind of like a historical and linguistic detective story. We're asking a pretty monumental question here. What if the modern evangelical doctrine of inerrancy, the idea that the text is absolutely flawless in its historical and scientific claims, what if that is built entirely upon a linguistic shift that happened hundreds of years after the text was actually written? To guide us through this whole mystery, we're drawing on some really groundbreaking philological research by scholar John C. Poirier. It's all detailed in his book, The Invention of the Inspired Text. Basically, this is a deep dive into the linguistic history, the philological windows, of the Greek word that sits right behind our English word inspired. Poirier's research serves as the core evidence for investigation today, and I gotta tell you, his findings present a major, major challenge to traditional views of inerrancy. So we have this really stark contrast that we have to reckon with. Take the modern English word inspired. When we apply that word to Scripture today, it carries so much theological weight, right? It's often read to imply verbal dictation and absolute, flawless inerrancy. But the original ancient Greek term used by the author of 2 Timothy is Theopneustos. And Poirier argues that the English translation is rarely just allowed to function innocently. Instead, it's basically served as a vehicle to smuggle a whole modern system of ideas straight into the ancient text. So we really need to investigate what Theopneustos actually meant to the people who were using it out in the ancient world. Okay, Section 1, the pre-origin meaning, investigating the ancient crime scene. To really grasp the original meaning, we actually have to travel way back in time, before the 3rd century CE, and look at how this Greek word was used, out in the wild. When we catalog the pre-Alexandrian usage of Theopneustos, a really clear pattern emerges. In the Sibylline oracles, it describes swelling streams. In the Testament of Abraham, it modifies burial ointments. And over in the writings of Vettius Valens, it refers to the immortal soul. Now, do you notice what is completely missing here? There is absolutely zero connection to writing, or to divine authorship, or to flawless texts. In every single early instance, the word is used to describe something completely unrelated to a written document. Let's ground this in some tangible reality. Think about these micro-examples for a second. In the Testament of Abraham, the text talks about theopneustic burial ointments. Why? Well, because these ointments were meant to preserve a body for future reanimation. They were literally meant to impart life. In the Sibylline oracles, it refers to waters that give life to the earth. So in literally every pre-originous use, the word is firmly, inextricably attached to the concept of breathing life into something, or granting life. And this brilliantly illustrates the 2 competing definitions right at the heart of Poirier's argument. On one side, we have the vivificationist meaning, which just translates to giving life or breathing life into something. This, the historical evidence shows, was the exclusive original meaning of the word. But contrasted with that is the inspirationist meaning. That's the modern idea that a text is verbally dictated, epistemically perfect, and flawlessly authored by God. Poirier argues that the original meaning was vivificationist, period, and that the inspirationist meaning was wrongly substituted much later on. Moving on to our next section, the origin switch, the turning point, in 216 CE. So you might be wondering, if the original meaning was life-giving, how on earth did we end up with flawless dictation? Well, enter the main culprit of our linguistic mystery, a highly influential Alexandrian church father named Origen. To understand Origen's shift, we have to understand who influenced him. Origen was heavily influenced by Philo's understanding of the nature of Scripture. Philo basically viewed the biblical text as fundamentally divine, where God was the true author. Under this influence, Origen started to read Theopneustos through a completely new lens. He was actually the first person in history to use the term to describe the absolute character of divinely inspired words. He argued that the Spirit dwells within the text itself, making every single dot a vessel of divine wisdom and hidden mysteries. Basically, he shifted the entire meaning from what the text does, which is give life, to where the text came from, meaning divine dictation. Tracing this shift across history shows this really dramatic snowball effect. It's wild to look at. Pre-216 CE, the term strictly meant vivification or life-giving. Then, right there in the middle, we have 216 CE, Origen's shift to inspirationism, emphasizing absolute divine authorship. From there, this brand new definition just snowballed. By the time we reached the 19th and 20th centuries in the modern era, the specific 3rd century interpretation had evolved into these rigid doctrines of absolute infallibility and inerrancy, where the text is expected to be a flawless historical and scientific record. Which brings us to the next section, the inerrancy debate, a house of cards. And that brings us right into the modern era, specifically those fierce theological battles of the 19th and 20th centuries. Poirier actually portrays this whole modern debate over inerrancy as a bit of a house of cards built directly on Origen's linguistic shift. And we can really see this by looking at two titans of theology, Benjamin Warfield and Hermann Kramer. Warfield, who was a huge, celebrated champion of inerrancy, argued deductively. He basically relied on a supposed rule of word formation to claim that the words simply must have a passive meaning, that the text is God-breathed or authored by God. But Hermann Kramer, he relied on an actual historical philological database. Kramer looked at real sources like Plutarch and the Sibylline oracles to show that the word had an active meaning, meaning the text breathes out God's spirit. It actively gives life to the reader. Now, Warfield's view largely went out in evangelical circles, and that was heavily driven by what you'd call a slippery slope argument. Warfield insisted that inspiration is an element of the faith that literally cannot be rejected without logically undermining our trust in all other elements. Essentially, his point was, if Scripture isn't perfectly flawless in all of its details, how can we possibly trust its theological claims? Poirier points out that this totalizing argument locked in the massive weight of inerrancy, a weight that was built directly upon Origen's specific 3rd century redefinition of just a single Greek word. Let's look at our final section, rethinking inspiration, the fallout. So where does this all leave us? What actually happens when we remove this 3rd century lens from our eyes? Well, let's summarize the core findings of our explainer today. First, the English translation inspired has effectively smuggled modern ideas about factual accuracy straight into the ancient text. Second, the original Greek word, theopneustos, meant life-giving or vivifying. Third, and this is fundamental, 2 Timothy 3:16 was not originally making a claim to factual inerrancy or infallibility. Instead, and actually I think this is the most beautiful takeaway, the text was designed to actively breathe life into the reader, much like those life-giving springs or vivifying breath we talked about earlier. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to consider. If the original ancient authors intended their text to be life-giving, rather than scientifically or historically flawless, how does that change the way we approach them today? Does it maybe free the reader from defending a modern standard of absolute inerrancy, allowing us to experience the text exactly as the ancients intended, as a living, breathing force? It's a fascinating question for sure, and one that really challenges us to look deeper into the hidden origins of the beliefs we take for granted. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.